it's not like Australia's a third world country. And
Mm,
it literally
right.
like 4 or 5 days before the helicopters could come out.
Crazy. Yeah. Yeah. Well, apparently, Chris can tell us about that, but yeah, apparently the Santa Ana winds have been blowing too fast for fire suppression aircraft to get up above the fire.
I'm not quite, he might, he's here, but I think he's boiling his kettle.
Yeah, maybe.
Um, no, I'm here. Hopefully you can hear me.
Yes, we can.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
How are you? We've been concerned.
my video camera is not working for some reason.
Okay.
Surprise, surprise. But I also don't have my usual setup. So Tuesday night, amongst the 80-mile-an-hour winds, I escaped to San Marino, about 20 minutes by car south
Mm.
of our house, which coincidentally is literally 2 blocks south of the origin of the fire.
Oh, wow.
Um, Super shocking to me. Our house as of yesterday apparently was still standing. I haven't seen it myself. The National Guard has closed off our neighborhood, and you can't even get in with a resident ID.
Wow.
Um, but everything to the east and west of me and to the north totally burned down.
Wow.
There's probably, if you look at the fire map, usually most of the maps have a little fire symbol where it started.
Hmm.
And literally 2 blocks south of that is my house. And you'll
Wow.
see like a little circular part of city that somehow was saved, and everything else around it is burned. So this is
Wow.
a weird armpit. Um, but there are still spot fires, so they're not letting us back in.
Mm.
And honestly, if any neighborhood was going to go up, I would have expected it to be our neighborhood and not all of the rest of Altadena.
Mm.
Um, but here we are.
Wow.
So the survivor guilt is already starting to kick in, I think, a little bit. And so that's my excuse, Professor, for why I haven't done all the reading this week. Um,
Yeah.
but I've been trying to go up every day to see if anything is still there. And I
Hmm.
can get close enough to the neighborhood to know I think it's there. There's one or two neighbors we've got who've idiotically, I mean, just totally idiotically have stayed.
Mm.
Um, uh, but
So they get,
they've
so they're
so
able
I've
to
seen
be,
I've seen at least a picture of our house standing in the last day, which is, good news.
wow.
So hopefully but we're gonna have to do some kind of heavy smoke and ash and soot mitigation because with I went back Wednesday morning and managed to sneak into our neighborhood and get into the house. Our modern windows that I would have expected to have been well sealed off
Mm.
had ash and soot inside the windowsill.
Wow.
Um, and I think that's more a testament to how bad the winds were
Hmm.
at the beginning of the fire. Because literally, I was there all day, and I left to go to a class at UCLA at about 5 o'clock. And the power had gone off at 4. In
Mm.
because the heavy winds, they just shut the power off as a precaution.
Hmm.
Um, but when I came back at night, literally, the fire was like 2 blocks to the east of us and just kind of ripping through everything. And the winds at that point were in the 60 to 70 mile an hour range. But had been up as high as there were sustained gusts in the 100-mile-an-hour range earlier in the day while I was at home.
That's what I heard. Yeah.
Um,
God.
and I that really it's the winds that first day,
Mhm.
Tuesday night into Wednesday really did 90% of the damage.
Mhm.
Um, so as I was escaping, I literally drove down and was right the main street out was right next to everything that was on fire.
Wow.
So I drove by probably 50 fire trucks, um, It was on the national news. There was um, an old folks home with elder care 3 blocks from us,
Mm,
and they had evacuated them out of that home that was right in the path of the fire, a block away to a 7-Eleven.
mm.
So when I drove by the day before yesterday, that parking lot was full of wheelchairs and gurneys because they had loaded everybody onto ambulances, and those ambulances were leaving as I was leaving. So
Wow.
um, I don't know. It's very surreal to see, fire and embers blowing across, the street
Hmm.
between a 7-Eleven and a McDonald's.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Like a war zone.
and then to see everything on TV has just been, you know, it's been way worse because they're never showing you the neighborhood you want to see.
Right.
So I don't
Yeah.
know,
Yeah. Wow.
miserable time. And then
Yeah.
and then yesterday I'm hearing, as many as, 5 to 7,000 structures just in the city of Altadena that are just gone
Mm.
is insane.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
well, my fingers are crossed and we'll see what happens, but
Yeah.
heavy aid is starting to come in, it looks like. So, um,
Mm.
the 10 or I know at least 10 people have lost homes
Wow.
or heard have lost homes. So,
Hmm.
but it's screwy to hear. I think the weirdest one is the Altadena fire station and sheriff station, which are like 2 blocks apart, both burned down.
Mm.
But surprisingly, in the Palisades, the main fire station there is still standing, and it's the only thing standing on the entire block, which
Wow.
also includes some close friends we've got and they live in the city center. Um, but they spent the last 2 years tearing their house down to studs, rebuilding it. So they've been couch surfing and Airbnb-ing it for the last 2 years. They finally got in about 6 months ago,
Mm.
only for this to happen, literally a block from a fire station,
Wow.
and they couldn't save it. So,
Wow.
um, just insane.
Yeah. 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 And so what are they talking about the cause? Is it a electrical wire thing
Um,
or
I have heard through some locals on a thread that I'm on for our neighborhood that a neighbor and we're right on the border of, um, there's an arroyo, which is a Spanish word for like dry ditch.
Mhm.
So essentially it is dry most of the year. And oddly, this is the time of year usually we have heavy rains for like 2 weeks. And that arroyo fills up with water. It washes down through to a basin, and then it's done. And then everything grows and goes from there.
Mhm.
So we're right up against the wilderness and this massive mountain, forested mountain in the LA National Forest is in that area.
Mhm.
Um, but apparently, this neighbor saw in the high winds, there are high tension wires in the mountain just next to us. And she saw one of them snap and sparks and called fire that moment.
Mhm.
Um, and oddly, I think they're one of the few people probably who lost their home um, at the beginning of it. But when that happens and there's high winds, they literally, every firefighter in the county moves on it immediately because they know it's going to be this. I'd seen it once um, in 2018. I think it was a homeless started fire
Mhm.
that hit at about 4 o'clock, um, roughly this time of year. And they had 100 firefighters show up almost instantaneously.
Mhm.
And I think they knocked most of it down even before it got dark. Um, but in that case, there were no winds. So literally, it's the hurricane force winds
Right.
combined with the fire that did, at least for the Eaton fire. I'm not sure. I've heard rumors that the Palisades fire started in someone's backyard,
Mm.
and then got out of hand, but I don't know what the cause for it was and or haven't heard. So, um, but remains to be seen what's going on there.
Yeah.
Um,
Wow.
but it just miserable business all around. And then the screwy part too is that, and no one's talking about it, but in the midst of all this fire, there was a day and a half's worth of heavy winds and sustained heavy winds, like in the 40, 50 mile an hour range across half of the county. So a lot of people, even if you're not affected by the fires, you're dealing with picking up fallen down trees,
Hmm.
leaves, and debris, and it's all the debris is what's catching on fire in the wind as well.
Right.
Um, but just the wind event would have been enough of a mini disaster and probably one of the worst in 20, 30 years. And then you've added the fire on top of that. So you've all these people are cleaning up all this debris, but they're doing it in the smoke plume where the air quality is in the two and almost 300s, which
Wow.
is just insane.
Yeah.
I don't know why anybody would be outside. This morning, finally, the air quality is in kind of the yellowish orange area south of where the fires are.
Mm.
Um, but literally, it's, we broke out the COVID masks because the air quality has been so horrendous. And naturally, that's where we're staying is 20 miles south, right in the plume of all the smoke.
Wow.
So we're inside and with the hatches battened down.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, we didn't have most of these areas have had no power since Tuesday, and we only got internet service back, you know, middle of the day yesterday. So
Wow.
I fully expected to try and see if I could even call in by phone, but you
Mm.
know,
Well,
we've got some voice at least, if not video.
yeah.
Maybe my
Oh,
video
all
will
right.
turn back
Glad you're
on,
here. Yeah. Yeah. Wow.
or I
Yeah.
can get my phone camera to work.
Yeah. I was, yeah, I mean, I only started really kind of hearing, I mean, catching up with the sort of the stories of the week, um, really kind of yesterday and realizing, the extent of this. And yeah, that was sort of my immediate thought was, that sounds like exactly where you are.
Yeah. Well, I was reminded because a couple months ago we talked about both the Chicago fire and there was another one, I think, in Wisconsin that,
Yeah.
you know, I think you mentioned and no one had ever heard of, or it's
Has to
not
go.
commonly
Yeah. Yeah.
spoken about, but it's like, it's almost exactly that. But
Well,
it's also happening with, modern firefighting equipment
hmm.
being available.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and they typically talk, I mean, and the Peshtigo was a cutover fire. And typically you hear, when you hear about Western, forest fires all the way from, South Dakota through the parks and everything, it's about forestry practices and loads. But it sounds like mostly where your fire has been, it's just sort of dry conditions, the regular, kind of the regular load of organic stuff, and I have heard, maybe eucalyptus trees.
Yeah, there's some in chunks of Southern California. Most of it is uh, you know, oaks,
Mm,
evergreen.
okay.
Um, there's a lot of we're kind of in a desert-esque
Hmm.
environment, so there's a lot of small shrubs and chaparral, especially in Eaton Canyon.
Hmm.
Um, but the issue is we've had two very incredibly wet years, and then I think there's been less than 2/10 of an inch of rain in the last year.
Mm,
So all that stuff that's grown up for 2 years is now dead and dried out
right.
and just kind of gone. And usually this week is when what I would call our winter is the 2 weeks of rain we get in January.
Hmm.
Um, and usually it starts right after New Year's, goes for, it's almost like a mini monsoon.
Hmm.
and that's all the rain we get for the year. It may rain once in March, and again, like a little, we'll get some spit sometime in August, and then somehow it always seems to like rain for 10 minutes on Halloween at like 8 or 9 or 10 o'clock at night. And I only noticed this literally because we take a kid and go trick or treating.
Walking around, yeah.
Um, but that's it. There's no other rain outside of that.
Yeah.
Um,
Wow.
and there's gonna be some huge political fallout because of um, water management.
Right. Right. Yeah, which has already kind of begun. Yeah. And that seems like putting the cart a little before the horse.
Yeah.
There's still, the situation hasn't been addressed yet, and people are starting to spin cycles and spend energy on pointing fingers.
So I don't know.
Yeah. So, and yeah, and then a week from Monday, we got the whole new thing begins again.
Yeah.
So it's a strange year so far.
Yeah. So my 2025 has started off with a bang.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, so what do you want to talk about, Chris? Like I sort of feel like we should, I mean, I, I've delayed this for so long, kind of getting started on this book, this Graeber book, which I am excited about starting, but um, you know, I kind of feel like I should sort of throw it over to you
And
and
I'm out of it. Like, we're in stress protection mode to some extent. I actually went out yesterday and drove south and got another copy of the book because mine is
Mm,
locked away up ostensibly for, I think if we're lucky, we may get back in Sunday or Monday if
well,
there's something still to get back into.
I hope there is.
Um,
I hope you end up with two books.
um, I did when I went back on Tuesday night, I went to make sure the dog and everything was out of the house, all the people. But fortunately, my wife and kid, the kid was at ballet 2 blocks from grandma's house where we're at now.
Mm,
Um, and then my wife was coming back from work downtown to get the kid, and they were going to have dinner and then come back home.
mhm.
And then she called me at 7 o'clock and said they're evacuating our neighborhood for a fire. Um, and of course, I'm sitting in class looking on my phone trying to figure out what's going on. And the one thing I see is the fire is literally 2 blocks from our house, and I know there's been 80-mile-an-hour winds all day.
Right.
And I'm like, oh shit. So
Right.
I left in the middle of class and
Mm.
like guys, I gotta go.
Yeah, what a shock.
So
And
I rushed over and I grabbed like 3 things just in case we have like a go bag and some stuff because we've had at least 2 evacuation warnings before,
mhm.
although it's super uncommon. And prior to this, it was you're ready just in case, but you don't expect you're ever going to have to go because you live in very urban,
Yeah,
Los Angeles.
right.
Even though you're next to a mountain and a forest zone,
Yeah.
and coyotes pop up in the street on a regular basis,
Mhm.
um, you just don't think.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, it's like everybody
so
has
we
some
had that stuff.
survival.
So I was able to go in, grab 3 things in the dead dark with like the scary part for me was I had 5% left on my phone, so I couldn't even turn on a flashlight.
Mm,
Um, but I got stuff, got in the car, and then just raced out.
yeah.
And the next morning, I came back and got a couple days worth of clothes and 10 other things,
Mhm.
um, including I did manage to pull a drawer of cards out of the filing cabinet. And I'll tell you what, I really love that filing cabinet's ability to just pull a drawer right out and walk away with it.
Yep.
It's now paid for itself 10 times over in
Yeah.
peace of mind.
Yep.
Um, I was half tempted to take the whole thing, but I didn't think it fit in the car. So,
Mm.
and my wife would have been upset if I came back with, a filing cabinet and no clothes. So,
Yep.
I got like 4 or 5 days of clothes, shoved them in a couple
Sure.
suitcases, along with our neighbors who, they were at home when it happened, so they came next door and got our dog
Mm.
and took her down, and they had nowhere immediate to go, so they stayed with us. So we had this tiny house packed with, I don't know, dozen people almost, it seems, and
Mm.
three dogs and a rabbit.
Wow.
It was pretty entertaining. And then they went down to their parents live in San Diego, so they're down there for the rest of the week.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah, it is
but
great with communism. Yeah, in emergency, yeah, refugee situations. Yeah.
but as I'm pulling that drawer out of the filing cabinet, I'm thinking of uh, it was one of the older German guys in the 1700s. He's like, if there's a fire or something bad happens, save the big black case.
Mhm. Yeah, right. Right. Or yeah, people with pack animals to carry. There was a story about that in or there was a discussion about that in one of the things we read, wasn't there? People carrying their notes with them as they
Yeah.
traveled around medieval Europe or whatever. Yeah. So,
But
well,
we should just move on to the book. A couple
okay.
weeks ago I read at least half of There Never Was a West.
Hmm. Yep.
Um,
Okay.
and I do it too, as I've been over the last couple months, I've been doing a lot of reading in history with respect to the perspectives of the barbarians invading into Rome,
Hmm.
and then first through like 8th century, maybe to the 11th or 12th century, you British history, or I'll
Hmm.
call it British history for lack of a better, just as a location name,
Hmm.
but Celts and Celtic peoples and Germanic peoples and all the intermixing that was happening in the UK for all those centuries in the post-Roman era,
Hmm.
and how oddly multicultural the UK is, but no one seems to want to say
Right.
that yes, it's all these people from the continent, all the people who were there, a bunch of people who moved in, all the
Mhm.
Scandinavians moving south, mixing and mixing and mixing for 1,500 years.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah,
and
it's interesting because I've been, sort of preparing for this. I'm teaching an ancient and medieval world, and then a U.S. history one and an African American history. So multiple sections of the U.S. history, and then in the second half of the semester, I'll be teaching World Two in an 8-week session. So I'll have to redesign it for that. But yeah, I've been kind of going back through that David Wright book and kind of filling in the details of figuring out how I'm gonna, because I am working with a textbook this time, because I didn't have time to, design something entirely new. So I'll be teaching I'll be teaching kind of against the textbook, but also, also sort of in supplement of the textbook.
Yeah, similarly, for completely unrelated reasons, it was like, so when was the last sort of Roman Empire, Roman saccade, as opposed to the various ones that have happened since, came up as a question, and then it was like, what was that, 350, 400 BC, AD? And in the process of that, there's the usual, oh, that looks interesting, follow that tree and follow that route through the forest.
Hmm.
And literally this week, it sort of bounced back as being, I think, the way that you know things, but you don't always know everything with the same level of connectivity
Hmm.
or context. And it's like, the Avion Empire.
Mhm.
that preceded the Plantagenet one. At the Avion Empire, when you've got Richard I, Richard the Lionheart,
Mhm.
King John, and Magna Carta, England at that point had sort of like Dublin, Wexford, and the next county up in Ireland,
Mhm.
but hadn't actually at that point managed to complete its conquest of Wales.
Mhm.
So they had sort of Cardiff out to Swansea and right over on the far west, Milford Haven, and not much else.
Mhm.
And at that point, it goes, oh, that was the Green Line. And you can drive round there now, and everything is in English and Welsh.
Mhm.
And of course, as you cross the Green Line, the Welsh becomes Welsh.
Mhm.
So the village that might be called, I don't know, whatever, Landfall, say, in English, is also called Landfall in Welsh because English never got there in the, whereas Cardiff and Cardiff and Welsh are two different words.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah. It's interesting what's
and I
unfolding
had,
of these
and I
stories.
hadn't really put, and I had to put that two and two together.
Uh-huh.
And in the same way as this is like what the fourth bit of stuff we're reading from Graeber,
Mhm.
there, and particularly if you look at the introduction by the editor, there is a. Having read that, I've got to go back and read it again because having got into the meat of this first big essay, I got lost in the sense he's bouncing around too fast at some point, and it's like he agrees that one, as an analogy, he agrees that 1 + 1 is 2, but says that I reserve the right to say that 2 + 2 may not be 4. Is how I sort of got myself in a pickle because of not having the history he's talking about.
Yeah.
At which point, one of my notes that I had, but I haven't gone back to do anything with yet, comes up as being, and relates to Magna Carta as being the big thing from very early English period. I mean, we're still talking Canterbury Tales, and English as a language hasn't quite fixed. Not that it ever has, but it's there. And it was so until we get to like the big French Revolution and the American Revolution in 1770,
Yeah.
what do we know as Anglophiles about the Magna Carta equivalents for the roots that were, say, like the Holy Roman Empire, which was pretty much Germany as we now think of it, but
Well,
with all the
yeah.
other funny connections. I mean,
Right.
you
Right.
go back to
And that goes to that argument about the about where in this like the third or fourth section of this where he's talking about the argument between the he talks about the plan of union of 1754, and Ben Franklin and the Iroquois Confederacy and all of that. And so he's sort of going back over that territory that we've covered in the Dawn of Everything about about where did these ideas come from. But yeah, Magna Carta, I think stands, it needs, and the Charter of the Forest, especially also, I think, need more kind of attention. Although this is a very Anglophone version of this this
which
what's the word I'm
particularly
looking
because
for?
Yeah, Anglophone is the word you're looking
But
for.
no, that's not the, yeah, that one I got. The other thing was lineage, I guess, of these ideas was the word I was
Yeah.
grabbing.
And sitting here, of course, 25 degrees north and 4 hours east rather of Greenwich Mean Time. Um, I still see the Muslim world in historical terms from an Anglophone direction,
Mhm.
but I have English Arabs writing books in English,
Yeah.
so there's no translation issues, and they're talking about Islamic science and Islamic math
Mhm.
back then, but they're also talking about their religious fundamentalism revolution of about 1600.
Right. Well, and
Well,
you're also in a place where they're celebrating it, right? Because you sent me
yeah,
that photo of the model of the Zhonghai ship from the mall. So
and,
they're really into
and,
all of their tradition.
and here, elsewhere not so much, but here particularly, I'm looking round and I can't see. Oh, there's one guy. I can see one guy who is clearly local Arab because he's in local dress.
Hmm.
Everybody else could have gone to Gap just as easily.
Yeah.
Right. So it's a real mixing pot. And it is almost everybody's first question after what is your name is where are you from?
Yeah. Sure.
Because almost nobody is from here in multiple generations. So,
Mhm.
but there are what people that I think of as being Arab who who are as far as the locals are concerned, Pakistani.
Mhm.
But they've been here for like since the British Empire.
Mhm.
Yeah. And it's like the one thing that brings me back, being part Welsh, is at which point do I turn around and say the English are the invaders?
Yeah. Yeah.
And therefore rile against all those people who are much more clearly one step closer to their indigenous roots, and then blame people that look like me for the problem.
Mhm.
As so, hang on a minute, you know, not that long ago, I've had to put up with the English for 1100 years almost,
Right.
as it were. You guys have only had to put up with the British for like the last 400 or something, whatever it is. So,
Mhm.
and that was one of the things that I sort of joked at internally over Brady's Sweet Class.
Well,
In
and
terms,
that's interesting from especially from the British, within this English speaking
yeah,
world, from the British perspective, that's a much more ancient um, issue, right? In the U.S., it's so much more recent that we don't,
yes,
tend to have
yeah,
that ability to sort of peel
yeah,
those thick pieces of the onion, the thick layers of the onion back and say, well, wait a minute, at what point did this group become English, British,
yeah.
sort of align their culture and their,
And,
their agenda and their priority with the ruling
and
class.
particularly with his talk about the idea of democracy,
Yeah.
where did it come from?
Hmm.
And I must admit, I've not really followed that before or seen it written in that way.
Hmm.
And so I know of the Athenian ideal and all that sort of stuff. But I also know that they needed Sparta when dealing with the Persians,
Yeah.
for instance.
Yeah.
So I go in terms of what we then learned from Dawn of Everything,
Right.
in terms of the mechanism of how do we as a group make a decision, and we just and the Iroquois and the other Indian groups we talked about then, Candy Rocks group particularly,
Yeah.
we talk about it until we were exhausted.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. Well,
And
and that,
and
yeah.
of course, the book we should have been reading, that I'm reading on the side of all this, is Rory Stewart's bio of recent political life when he's become an MP, and I've not quite finished. So we're in the throes of him in the leadership contest against Boris Johnson after Theresa May has said she's going to resign.
Mm.
And then you see about, let's talk about it until we're exhausted type approach,
Yeah.
as how much have we given away,
Mm-hmm.
but then how can you talk across 66 million people
Mm-hmm.
in the UK?
Well,
Right?
and that's interesting from the perspective, as I've been sort of preparing for this to teach this ancient history class, one of ancient and medieval, one of the things that I've been doing is I've been listening to this other audiobook, right, which purports to be, it's called The History of the History of the Ancient World by Susan Wise Bauer, and it is long and in the sort of old-fashioned kind of Whig tradition is very much about okay, this happened, this ruler succeeded from this ruler, and this is what happened, and she does do a good job of sort of balancing between kind of what's happening in Asia and what's happening in Egypt, and what's happened, because I'm still at that point where we're into the historical period where there are documents, but it's Mesopotamia, Egypt. There was a little bit, the Greeks messed around a little bit, and then, but it's very much, sort of names and dates, wars. We're just getting to the point where, where Cyrus is becoming the king of, Persia, and he's going over and taking over the Median polity as well, and sort of becoming this emperor of this Persian Empire. And but it's very, it's so much about, these guys, these names, these rulers, these battles, as history has been for so long, that it's challenging to even be able to imagine when these types of things that Graeber is looking for, is searching for, kind of in the record, would even be available, you would be able to see them at all. I can imagine all kinds of things happening in the, the all of the people who lived who weren't those named folks, right? The Pharaoh of the 17th dynasty, or whatever. What is going on in the rest of these cultures, and that's really,
Yeah, for so long we've been like stuck with what people term as the great man theory of history,
totally.
all the big rulers and never the small.
Mhm.
In the last, it's only really been even in the last 20 or 30 years that we seem to be getting enough archaeological evidence, because most of it's not written,
Yeah. Well, and that's the
to
thing,
be able to look at what was the everyday life look like. Or
Mhm.
you go back and SD Goitin finds the Geniza, and he can now see what daily Jewish life looks like from the 9th to the 13th centuries
Mhm.
in northern Africa.
Right.
And we can see what people, and one of my favorites, there's a piece of manuscript that's literally a Jewish mother talking to her son, and it totally could read as a modern day New York Jewish mother, be stereotypical, son, you never visit, you never ride, I
Like
don't
that
see
Woody
you.
Allen would have wrote. Yeah.
I totally, it's exactly that, but having that kind of evidence is almost non-existent.
Mhm.
And lately I've been looking more closely, and there's a group that I found that's doing a year of Celtic mythology. So I am and I'm kind of interested in ancient Welsh and some of those written records, because that's one of the few very clear spots where you have a very oral culture that's crashing into an emerging literate culture. And what
Hmm.
does that look like? Do
Right.
we trust our elders who have been passing the knowledge along for centuries, or do we trust this new written stuff?
Hmm.
And there are, in the 8th through 11th centuries, there's super clear-cut examples of people who can write and use that not as a tool only for knowledge, but they're using it as a weapon of reframing history
Hmm.
so that they can say, hey, I've got this written documentation that the
Hmm.
king said we don't need to pay taxes anymore on this plot of land. And
Yeah.
it's a total fabrication.
Right.
And
Or,
at the time, there was no ability to look at what's going on to know that it's a fabrication.
mhm.
But we can, in retrospect, look at it and follow because usually these documents had names and
Hmm.
names in a certain order, so you could tell what the pecking order was
Mm.
of the power structure.
Right. Right.
So
Well,
as
even at
as
the tool of colonialism, right? I mean, I always wondered, and I was really into sort of Celtic mythology, back when the only thing, there was like a little book that you could buy and read that had, sort of original translations of the Mabinogion, from like Penguin or something. But then the thing that everybody went to was like Evangeline Walton's, novel series, which novelized a lot of those things. But I always wondered, the idea of Bran and and existing kind of on both sides of the Irish Sea, and what that whole thing was about, was yeah, just I always thought that was really interesting. It's kind of weird though, right? Because there's that whole a lot of the times people kind of look at Graeber and they say, can't prove it, can't prove it. You're speculating, and is that's kind of the point, I think, of what we've been talking about, right? That you've got these kings lists, all the way back to like some of the first things that we have from Mesopotamia, and so we have some idea of what was happening, at a very, kind of, we assume the elitist level of the society, right? But what's happening in the rest, right? And the things that Graeber speculates about, I find it very interesting to imagine, a way in which we could validate any of that? Or is it just going to be, do you choose to believe, these ideas, these kind of generalizations about human nature that would lead you to suspect that, some of the things that
But if you cut back to the Roman Republic period, you have the writings of Caesar and Cicero, for instance, right? As high up in the hierarchy as they obviously were, they're also talking about what happens at the base end. Now, if you saw the HBO series for Rome,
Mhm.
that those two working class people that were the real stars, as in Apollo and Verenus, they're in Caesar's writing, only one each, but they're there, right?
Yep.
Um, and and of course, the empire then goes on with its various historians to reinforce what happened in the old republic and at a change point, as in the Julian period. Uh, so that seems to be quite tight and clearly not far on to that. You've got, you can get into the UK as it now is. You've got that bit of Roman, you've got that Arthurian element of the legend of the Celt side,
Mhm.
and then you end up with going through Canterbury Tales with the language changes at the point of Magna Carta, give or take.
Mhm.
Um, and that was what was intriguing me was
But
coming at it
you've got this whole Anglo-Saxon history between the
yeah,
Celts and the Norman invasion, right?
yeah, yeah, and the Dukes,
Yeah.
and yeah, well, so if you take some of the Hollywood type Arthurian elements, it's a Briton against Saxons. The
Mhm.
Dukes and the Angles haven't turned up yet,
Okay.
right? But from my general history, that seems to be a bit out of sync. But then the Saxons dominate, so you end up with Alfred Great
Hmm.
as the great Saxon king
Hmm.
that then passes it on to Edmund, and then Harold, who loses it to the Norman side. But the Normans are just other versions of Viking in
Hmm.
that context. You know? And they obviously
Well, they
are
kind of are the
part and parcel
descendants
of
of,
what,
aren't they?
and part and parcel of what he's talking about in terms of movement of people. Is, of course, Normans also their part of their other empire part of space is
Hmm.
Sicily. It's as far away as you can get in Europe as you can think, really.
Right. Right.
You know?
Kingdom of the Two. Yeah.
And,
Yeah. Well, and
and
that lasts a whole lot longer as a Norman. It doesn't, they get integrated, right? So they're the overlords of southern Italy and Sicily and the island. Yeah.
yeah, and not just Sicily, they then start to go up, you
Right.
know, as in the Norman kingdom and Napoli. So,
Yeah.
but the um, I'd have to go back into other places just to revisit mostly on the Conquista or the Reconquista, because that really changes the, because we've taken it back
Yep.
and cleaned it up, which is not that, not spoken of that much in some respects.
Yeah.
We've now got, when Columbus leaves, there is no Spain. When he comes back, there's a Spain,
Well, Ferdinand
give
and
or take.
Isabella are married in 14
But there isn't
nine or 70 or something, right?
but it's the mental thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's
Well, they also
I
expel
owe
the Jews and institute
I
the
owe
Inquisition in
allegiance to my
1490.
immediate lord,
Yeah.
right? So I go up a feudal system. Countries don't really matter in the same sense as England is a parcel of the Avion and then the Plantagenet Empire.
Mhm.
We want all those duchies because that was the functional level.
Yeah.
Same as I've got a Duke of Bedford and Norfolk and Suffolk, Duke of Westminster. Um, and that's your direct line of allegiance.
Yeah.
At some point, we then say, "Oh, we got countries,"
Right.
you know, and it looks at that, and the flip point seems to start with Spain and Portugal.
Well, and and I think you're right. It seems to start when they turn when that I mean that centuries old tradition of the Reconquista, turns outward, right, and becomes a national. They become a nation because they have a national project that's outside their borders. So maybe that's the thing. One of the things that struck me early on in this was this idea that he talks about the marrying democratic procedures or practices with the coercive mechanisms of the state, and that there's something that there's a difference between, because I like to spend a lot of my time with students because they're not familiar with it at all, talking about consensus, right, and talking about the idea that you sit there until everybody says they can at least grudgingly agree. And I think he does a good job mentioning that, that there are levels of agreement, and that those are sort of understood, if not kind of institutionalized, but that, but that we don't really have democracy until we have that ability, as we understand it now, until we have that ability to enforce the kind of capitulation and the obedience of the people who were the minority and didn't get anything that they wanted and have no reason to participate voluntarily because they were, completely overlooked and they weren't part of they weren't part of any type of a consensus. So I think that was kind of a kind of an important moment for me, that idea. And then also when he starts talking about sort of this the slipperiness, this section he calls the slipperiness of the Western eye or the European eye. The Western eye, I guess. I thought was kind of fascinating too. This approach that he says tends to see deliberation merely as balancing interests rather than a process through which subjects themselves are constituted or even shaped. And I guess maybe the conclusion that I'm sort of drawing from that is that having practiced these things in these relatively anarchistic organizations that he was part of through the 90s and into the 2000s, I think gave him a lot of kind of interesting insights that somebody who was purely looking at it from a theoretical perspective wouldn't have been able to throw in there.
Yeah, I think he had a thing, I think on page 7, one of my favorite snippets was he says it's a crisis of state and not of democracy. So it's kind of, he's trying to pull apart the ideas of democracy or the definitions of what we call democracy and separate it as a form of government versus how the government is actually done and run. And even in the modern world, the democracy in the US is different than the democracy in Britain, is different than the democracy of, or even the democracy of the Altadena City Council is dramatically different than the town council in Burlington, Connecticut.
Right.
Or it's seen in things like this, the Stars Hollow democracy of the Gilmore Girls, where everybody in the town gets together and they're all arguing
and yells. Yeah.
And the petty personal arguments like bleed over into the town politics, which is really a big microcosm of what U.S. politics looks like right now. It's not it's the petty that bleeds over into the how should we run our business.
Well, and which probably always was, right? That's one of the things that sort of fascinates me about, sometimes reading even imperfect, biographies like Ron Chernow's, biographies of the Gilded Age, right? Of people in that era, like, J.P. Morgan or somebody, that there's so much personality in that. And so, which sort of goes against the grain for me because I want, my impulse is to sort of take it away from those, great men and sort of elite bickering and all of that. But there is some of it in there.
Well, is where the other oddball collection comes up. By fluke, YouTube decided to give me a scene from Odysseus, of where Odysseus comes home after all the years. And this is the version that's being where Odysseus is Ralph Fiennes.
Well, I haven't seen that one.
And of course, Ralph Fiennes is also one of the leads in The Conclave, new film from Robert Harris's Catholic corruption story. And so I know the story in the sense of never read it, But another story, from things like the back end of Jason the Argonauts and so forth. Yeah, that one for Return. And Fiennes is an oddball actor. There's been a couple of films where he's been in, which are quite light, jokey, not quite comedies, but. And then there's been other ones where he's played opposite M in 007 movies, and then he became it as well. So he's had some real serious stuff, and he's had some real non-serious stuff. And in this return version of a Disney story, he's full on Shakespearean Jean-Luc Picard type piece. And so there's this old guy in a bunch of rags comes into this meeting room, which has got almost no decoration in, badly lit, sits in a dark corner, and everybody ignores him.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, Penelope comes. Is Penelope? Yeah, Penelope. She comes up and says, I can't make up my mind, so it's going to be, who of you could actually set the string to this bow and shoot it through the whatever the hole was?
Yep.
So 3 or 4 lusty young guys try it, and they can't do it. And then, so Ralph finds this old, relatively old, he's my age, and throws off his rags, comes down in a loincloth, but all muscled up, as though he's been on the Matt Damon course on how to become Jason Bourne in a week.
Mm-hmm. But that was all Athena's doing. She did that for him, right? In that moment. She snapped her fingers and he became buff.
Yeah. And so he warms up the bow over an open fire and then puts it on his body such that he can lever it. And none of the others are really haven't really thought about how to do it. Right. And within like 2 minutes, he's strung it. Mm-hmm. And the first one to object, he goes over his shoulder, picks out a bow, and he's straight through the heart. Mm-hmm. And then within like 15 minutes, everybody bar one other person and his son in that room is dead. Penelope in the other room have already skedaddled and locked the door. Which was, I thought, why would they lock the door?
Well, I think Telemachus is working with him by that point, isn't he?
Yeah. So but it's in 2 pieces. It's only about 10 minutes long, that scene. Yeah. But in 2 pieces of YouTube video, it was really good. And then, of course, it's like because it wasn't very clear what film name was. So I opened up Wikipedia, put our finds in, and then, of course, the Conclave came up. So I thought, okay. And ever since then, YouTube's been flooding me with Conclave clips. But it's the story, the forefront of the Greek civilization becoming Athens and Sparta against the Persians after they've done their bit with Troy, which was a whole few centuries earlier, whatever it was. So how did you go from the fact that I come back to my house after 30 odd years of not being here and string a bow and shoot everybody in their room to reclaim my wife as opposed to she just can't just say it. Mm-hmm. And now we've got a slave-driven militaristic democracy that says they are radically different from Sparta, who is a militaristic, slave-driven. I'm not even quite sure what the word for Sparta is. As opposed to simple monarchy. Yeah.
Well, that reminds me of his other.
We're radically different.
That reminds me of Graeber's other great statement that he says, in other words, if a man is armed, then one pretty much has to take his opinions into account. So, and then he goes on from there to talk about, since you're talking about Sparta and Ithaca and Athens, he says he's trying to define the term again, and he says it appears to have been coined as something of a slur by its elitist opponent. It literally means the force or even the violence of the people. So Kratos versus Archos or Arcos. So that I had never really thought about that there might be another way to define the will of the people and the organizational principles that are involved in a society than the force or the violence. But then I wanted to ask you guys about this thing that he goes on to talk about, these ugly mirrors, institutions that he says promoted or supported by elites that reinforce the sense that popular decision making could only be violent, chaotic, arbitrary mob rule. I thought that was ugly mirrors was a concept that I hadn't. I mean, and then it comes up in his later several of his later essays as well. But this is the first time I went into that. That we have institutions that our civilization creates or has created, and I assume he means has deliberately created opportunities for people to see popular decision making leading to chaos and leading to leading to outcomes that we don't want, and that this is an element of in the Graeber conspiracy, if there is such a thing, of the way that power operates to discourage people from wanting to have too much democracy.
Well, the thing that came through on Rory's book so far is you're there as a MP for nominal 5 years. You might be there 2 or 3 or 4, 5 even sessions, but you're there nominally for 5 years. But you get moved around. But you get moved around by your prime minister or your various prime ministers into different ministerial positions. And rather like with our prime minister being changed, the election results are known Thursday night, Friday morning. By Friday lunchtime, the replacement prime minister's in number 10. The first one's gone. We none of us wait fucking 2 months to move him out of the house.
Right.
Where's the democracy in that? Right, you've already made your decision. Get it done. Anyway, so Rory's in the same position as a minister. He started the morning as a Home Office minister doing prisons and ended up that afternoon under Theresa May when she wobbled before she resigned, being the senior minister for international development, which he'd been a junior minister before under Cameron for that. And literally, he was out running, got a phone call, went home, changed into a suit and went to the new office as the bags and stuff came from the old office up the road, albeit. And then, of course, you're then dealing with all the civil servants who think they've got the power because you're the amateur, right? Except in terms of international development, Rory's a diplomat and an ex-NGO operator in Afghanistan and Iraq doing international development. But yeah, I mean, he's way funnier, but not funny compared to Yes Minister. But there were literally instances where the same person, when he went back to international development, was decided to take a different direction from when he was the junior minister when he was the senior minister. And
do you think that's informed by the coalition that is now calling him back by their agenda?
The problem, if you catch up with him on his podcast with Alistair, I don't know what Alistair's name is now. Never have. Well, that podcast, it's ex-Labour member and ex-Tory member, because of course Johnson kicked him out after. So he's not even a member of the party anymore. So, yeah, thank you.
Okay, cool.
So, and Alistair Campbell, as much as he was a member, he was only press secretary. He wasn't. He's not an MP. But no, I think Rory's dug his hole sufficiently deep to not be called back. but
well, mission accomplished.
Yeah, in the West, since we've had the Gilmore Girls, we'll get the West Wing one in. There's several instances during the West Wing when Joshua Lyman says all politics is retail. And that's the other thing here. As big as Athens was, everybody that was anybody that could vote could get to vote. It would seem from memory, right? But so I come back to my previous comment. So how do you make sure that the conversation has been exhausted among 66 million?
Yeah, right.
By the time you do that, I mean, one of the things about Brexit thing is a good proportion of the older people, my parents' age, that voted for are now dead. Not just because of COVID. But at some point, what is the mechanism without proportionality and without representation? Do you make sure that the consensus is general enough? And it's like before Brexit, even Nigel Farage was talking about 52-48. He's not big enough.
Yeah.
Even though the previous referendum we've had on similar things have all had it needs to be 65% or it needs to be 3/4. And what do we get? We got 51 point something and 48 point something.
Right.
You know, as you know, if it was almost any normal election, you'd say I want a recount. Right?
Yeah.
And yet it's completely gone and changed everything on the drop of one. And it was, you know, this is an advisory referendum, and the government of the day rolled over, just literally rolled over. And more importantly, the individual that screwed it up resigned. So hasn't directly had to deal with the fallout.
Right.
So where's the consequences for those people that argue the position and then not because it necessarily goes the wrong way or the right way, just walks away from?
Well, not only that, but where's the continuity in actually understanding whether or not we're talking about the same thing? Because I think that feeds, I think what you're saying, Tim, is adjacent to and kind of the same question of this thing that Graeber's talking about in section C, right? Where he says, and I think he's quoting somebody here where he says, it was common for American and French political figures to see themselves as direct heirs to a classical civilization and to believe that all through history, from Athens to Rome to Boston and Paris, the same political forces have faced off in eternal struggles, right? That this is, you know, that left and right have always meant left and right, and that they've always had the same the same agenda and the same priorities and the same interests and the same concerns. And I think that that is just something that we sort of in history we sort of seem to accept, right? He's talking at one point he talks about and he's talking about American history. He says, well, at some point, people started calling themselves Democrats while probably standing for the same things that other, that previously people had. And now they're just using the term democracy where they would have substituting it for Republican, right? But I think that's a huge assumption, a huge sort of
Well, it's things
unvalidated, kind of.
it's things like you guys calling Bernie Sanders a communist, not you guys sitting here, but you guys generally. And it's like
He's a socialist.
he's sort of well right of my left-leaning
Social democrat.
socialism,
Yeah.
for Christ's sake. I mean, Stalin would have shot him on sight. Wouldn't have entertained it at all.
Well, that's the bigger problem we're facing, though, is all the definitions of what these words really truly mean. And the vast majority, and I'll speak only of Americans here, either don't care, aren't interested, or don't have enough education as a tool to be able to tease apart the differences, which goes back weeks to the idea of the great books being, the democratic equalizer. And that was some of what they were trying to accomplish is let's get the everyday Joe Plumber who doesn't care about the classics or the great reads.
At least put them on the show.
We just
The
lost
sound
your
has gone,
audio.
Chris.
We just lost your audio.
Oh,
Now we got you again.
that's weird. But we need to have enough commonality of culture behind us to be able to be a democratic society as a separate thing. And that's one of the biggest issues now in America that kind of teases the difference between what Graeber's talking about and some of the democracy piece versus the cultural and cultural beliefs is there's, and we literally use the words culture war as the means to divide us, to make the democracy go away. And without the common culture, if I can't get along with my, far right, brethren in the Deep South,
right?
And I'm even from the Deep South, like, how do you then create a system of government that is democratic in nature? And so there's so many painful layers of what are going on here that he is kind of revealing. Or if you prefer, I'll use the Greek word apocalypse here for its new meanings and many different layers and flavors. But that's what we're facing.
Yeah,
but only if it comes with napalm in the morning.
And even yes, smells like victory. I love the thing that he does there right after that quote too, where he talks about, educated people in the late 18th century were familiar with Athenian democracy largely through a translation of Thucydides by Thomas Hobbes. And that was when I discovered that. I didn't realize that Hobbes had translated Thucydides, and that was the translation of Thucydides that most people in that era had read. But that tells you something huge. And then later he talks about, okay, now we're moving, in our understanding of Athens, we're moving from Thucydides to Herodotus. And that changes the, kind of the tenor of what we imagine this place to be.
Well, it's similar and a smaller scale possibly, but your research into people naming their children Erasmus in rural New England, that same thing, all these rural people who were at least somewhat in tune with the science of the day in ways that there isn't I don't think there's a rash of people naming their kids Einstein or Newton or,
Mhm.
even,
Yeah.
who would be a good
Planck or
modern,
Heisenberg. Oh, there is Heisenberg came back.
or, nobody's naming their kid Dawkins,
Right.
you know,
Mhm.
as a result of
Yep.
popular science now. It doesn't happen.
Yeah. Yeah. Which means which means it was important to them that, at least to the degree that after you got through, and in a lot of cases it was, after you got through the tradition of, naming the first son after, whoever it had to be named after. I mean, in my tradition, it was first son was the paternal grandfather name, and then this, and there was a whole set of rules around that. Yeah, maybe we will have a bump of Elon's.
Or not rules, but at least cultural norms.
Right.
The other thing that's happened roughly at that time with the rise of tea and coffee houses is you're going to these places to exchange news,
Mhm.
and individual coffee houses specialized in different types of news. So there would be a particular coffee house for the shipping magnates.
Right.
um
Right. Or the
but
stock
we
traders.
don't
Yeah.
and some people might say, oh, but we
No,
have social media. We have social media now, so you have that same thing, but it's on a global basis. But the problem is when you're seeing someone face to face in a coffee house, you're forced to engage with them
Yep.
and have an actual conversation. Whereas on Twitter and most social media, you're really talking past each other rather than to or with each other.
Right. Using
well,
each
the,
cues for
the,
another comment stream. Yeah. I really
I
did get
can't,
the two quotes that Eric popped into the chat a while ago, but that idea of Western culture being something from textbooks and lecture halls and cafes and literary salons, is huge. I think uh, that's a really cool way of imagining that, and it reminds me a lot of, kind of the thing that attracted me to history in the first place, which was that Neil Stevenson series of novels about the 17th century and the beginning of the 18th century.
well, I mean, I can't remember the exact linkage that caused me to do it, but in the current chat line, the community discussion in Obsidian, there was a couple of things that I picked up with the
Oh
great
yeah, you've seen a
books.
lot of stuff in there recently. Yeah.
Uh, and it's just literally from somewhere else, and it's like, oh, okay, that's another one. But as much as we have that set of books, stroke encyclopedia that's going to go, there's a couple of others that are able to sit on the plum of a baker and the candlestick maker's bookshelf. They still have to read them. They may not read everything, they may not read everything cover to cover, but providing they're dipping, they're getting some of the language, they're getting some of the ideas, etc. But with the sheer number of copies that seem to be near mint condition that you and Chris and others have been able to pick up 50 plus years down the line,
Oh.
leads me to think they ain't reading them. But then if you go
Those
see,
trophies, you mean? Yeah.
yeah.
Yep.
But if you go to the local library and get the copy off the shelf at the library,
Mhm.
whereby it's been read by 25 years, 30 years worth of people, you'll
Mhm.
see the wear and tear, hopefully.
Yeah.
But again, with the same way as we just spoke about, we've got the 1800 people who are reading a Hobbes translation of, and then we come along and we move along to the next historian for a different view of ethics. How many views are there, and how easy is it for the man on the Clapham omnibus
Mhm.
to be able to make the linkages that he would need to make to actually understand those two versions of ethics?
Yeah. Well, and why is
I project.
what is motivating that reader to find Athens, right? And where is he slotting it into, his or her understanding of kind of the world?
Well, I even reading for today, it's caused me to have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 16. I've got 17 Wikipedia pages open. Just on the Graeber read for today, or the latter half of it.
Right.
And it's like, and it does jump about a bit, but he's still quite tight in the terms of 1 + 1 = 2. So now talk to me about why 2 + 2 should be 4. Right? There seems, but there's
I'm still not
a
100% sure I understand what that metaphor refers to.
Well, one of the things particularly is he's saying democracy doesn't really mean democracy that you think it does.
Right.
And we all seem to agree that.
Yeah.
In a sense, it doesn't mean, because it now means representation.
Or that or backed by force, right? Or that it's changed over time. Yep.
So we're not taking the 1 + 1 from Athens. We're throwing in a bit of Sparta. We're throwing in a bit of corruption.
Oh, okay.
That is clearly rife in the Roman Senate in the Republic, because the voting was done for money in many cases.
Yep.
That's why they wanted to make sure that Julius came back when they told him to come back, so that he didn't bring all the money from Gaul to then be able to buy his way out. In the same way as somebody called 45 and hopefully might never get to 47.
Oh, he's
We've got a week. I'll take it down to 5 minutes. Anyway.
All right. Well, that I'm not going there. But the interesting thing is that that it does seem like there's there is kind of something going on there with what we understand, or what we claim. I mean, and that's another. I mean, again, that's another one of my hypotheses as well. Is do we really think this, or is this what we say?
Well, I think also it's what we believe is right, that everybody understands, and therefore that's what gets said. But part of what I was going to interrupt with, I forget who the other person is. There was somebody that was writing about 2 of the founding fathers. I'm pretty sure that one of them was John Adams, and I forget who the other one was, who were constantly falling out. But one of them, John Adams or the other guy, made a point of making peace on each point and asking for input. Not that he necessarily took it, but it was deemed that he was sufficiently important that I want to know what you think and why. And therefore that informs the way I work.
Yeah.
And that seemed to work, I think, because you had relatively so few people active. And Parliament House, we've got 600 odd MPs. That's too many to be friends with all of them, but not too many that you don't actually at least recognise all of them. So you could interact. And there's this, one of the problems that came in through Dawn of Everything was the villages tended to be at the 150, 250 people's level, and we move around a bit, so we bump into other people. And that had an element of that more formalised with the big annual and 5 yearly fairs where everybody got together to do a bit of mingling. But then we also have whatever it was for Mexico City back in the day, pre-Columbus, was 500,000 plus. And in the 1600s, you had you know, China and Japan were having million people plus cities, whereas the Brits and the Dutch thought Amsterdam and London were big, along with Paris and Berlin, sort of thing. And yet they're dwarfed compared to Tokyo and Osaka and
Well, and even Constantinople.
That's it's
yeah.
that difference has been
pre-Muslim Constantinople is pretty small. Physically.
That difference has actually been heavily highlighted with the fires here, is the populations and the square mile of affected, both just between the Eaton fire and the Palisades fire, is it's I think it's over 50 square miles now. And the populations that are affected, who either have lost homes or had to evacuate, are larger, I think, than I'd have to look at where the numbers hit, but the square mileage and the numbers are larger than most major metropolitan American cities. Wow. Once you take out, especially the top 10 media markets. But LA County by itself is larger than all but, I think, 5, maybe 6 US states. And it drives my wife bonkers that you'll have a governor of Alaska showing up to run for vice president when literally a single county commissioner from Los Angeles has almost 10 times the number of people in terms of population that they're overseeing and trying to represent than the governor of a state. And it's even more when you get into things like the Electoral College and how that's structured. The imbalance in the democratic process of who's being heard and why is just totally, completely out of whack. But because it's a power structure that gives power to people who don't want to give it away because they're have heavy influence because of it, trying to get rid of that and make things more democratic is way, way harder because of the structures that are in place that hold it together. Or similarly with January 6th having just gone by as an anniversary, the outcome of what happened there that day was heavily influenced by people holding guns. So you have to listen to them, as the quote went, versus if that crowd had been predominantly black or brown with no weapons, there would have been, I would posit there would have been 10 times the number of deaths and way more people in jail for long term than have happened because those people happen to be white and have guns.
Yeah, there certainly, and in the same way that, no, I won't even go there.
But we don't.
But it does. I mean, even the election itself, right? It was sort of a question of, well, okay, if we had, it put a spotlight on that question of the popular vote and what it is that people want, and is it okay, right? And there are a lot of people who believe that, sort of the John Adams perspective, right? That the mob should not be given too much power, and that they're going to make emotional choices, and they're going to make unreasonable choices, and they're going to make choices that are based on not knowing the full picture, and these are all, I think, supported to some extent, or some people will argue that they're supported by this reelection of Trump. And, and on the one hand, there's some validity to that. But on the other hand, what's the alternative? What's plan B? I mean, that hasn't been working for us either, right? The idea that these,
Or once those people are in power, they're making choices based on either political or economic expediency rather than legitimate, rational choices. So,
or the things
yes,
that they promised, right?
if you're in Southern California, you should be much better and paying more attention to water management. But doing that is incredibly expensive. So let's let it slide
Hmm.
and hope for the best.
Hmm.
But then when a handful of fires show up and ostensibly, the number I've seen the last few days is in the $60 billion range for potentially rebuilding,
Yep.
what do you do? And when you mix it up with, can capitalism solve those problems?
Hmm.
And the answer comes back probably not, because although in some sense, huge numbers of insurers have left California and Florida because of things like fires and earthquakes and floods and hurricanes.
Sure.
So that piece, the capitalism may push it, and people, if insurers decide we're not going to insure Malibu or the Pacific Palisades anymore because of the proximity to forest and possible burns in the future, or
Mhm.
even Altadena,
Yep.
like we're not going to rebuild these places because, or we're not going to reinsure you if you do, which then makes it way, way more risky to rebuild there. So, but
Sure.
where are you going to go? Like, does Hollywood just disappear
Mhm.
overnight because a quarter of the power base of Hollywood or more, probably half or more, because you got to be really rich to be able to live in the Palisades.
Mhm.
Um, but Hollywood disappears because all those people move to New York, or they move to
Vancouver.
Austin, or they move to some other city
Yeah.
where they can be insured and still do the work they're doing.
Mhm.
And, unionization rules aside, that's another pressure on what's going on. But
Yeah.
the Palisades is going to be very difficult to rebuild because they've lost not just homes, but all the infrastructure,
Right.
post office,
Schools.
police stations, fire stations, all the schools, on the grocery stores. Like, if you're trying to rebuild in a community, how do you rebuild and live there when you can't go buy groceries?
Mhm.
Or you got to drive 30 minutes away to get groceries on a
Mhm.
regular basis. That's a huge problem.
Yeah, that's a huge problem. And and the idea of social insurance of some type, or or some type of public sector response uh, to an
Well,
uninsured situation.
I have heard almost nothing about it this week,
Yeah.
but you go back 2 or 3 years to the last set of fires, and you'll find a bunch of articles about people living in the Palisades who bought and have not only private fire insurance for themselves,
Mm.
but they also had private fire companies to protect their homes. And
Mm.
so, yes, you will see some of those pictures of the Palisades where the neighborhood's devastated, but there is a multi-million-dollar home still standing. And my guess is we're going to discover in a few weeks it's because they had a private fire company literally on call just for that one house.
Wow.
Um, and you're going to find a lot more of that. And you'll be able to see the stark difference because the Palisades is uber rich.
Right.
Altadena has a few pockets of wealthy neighborhoods, but most of the heavy devastation is going to be in all the poorer neighborhoods.
Mhm.
And I think sadly I heard a statistic that most of Northwest Altadena are African American populations, and they're going to be the hardest hit, but they also amounted for something like 76% of all Black owned businesses in Los Angeles County.
Wow.
So there's more African American owned businesses in those neighborhoods than anywhere else, and they just have been flattened.
Yeah.
And my guess is they probably, because that area of Altadena doesn't have a mayor, their only representative is really a county commissioner who's just one woman amongst several in the greater swath of LA County.
Mhm.
So because they don't have the representation that the rich Pacific Palisades does, or rich nearby Brentwood, which is now the fires encroaching,
Mm.
those people are going to get way more resources than Northwest Altadena is.
Mhm.
And it's literally because of the way the political structure and the representative democracies at the local level are structured
Mhm.
that they're going to be screwed.
Yeah.
Pasadenians who are affected are going to be much better because they have way better and a lot more representation, both at the local level and even at the state level, than Altadena does.
Mm. Yeah.
Um,
I haven't heard people saying Katrina yet, but I have heard people saying Lahaina.
yeah. Oh, the Lehigh immediately when I saw some of the pictures, I was like, that's totally Lahaina. And you look at where that is today, and a lot of that is what is the representation and push to rebuild or not rebuild there.
Hmm.
In their case, it's a big tourist destination.
Hmm.
So it
And it seemed like it was becoming a big land grab by, the people who had the most resources to buy up
yeah.
these distressed.
Or you can look at the microcosm in there are parts of Florida where Latino populations are being pushed out of some of the richer, nicer, higher land areas that are affected by hurricanes. So a
Hmm.
hurricane comes and flattens everything
Yep.
or damages it, and the people who are there are poor enough they can't afford to rebuild easily and don't get the resources, so they have to sell. And the richer developers come in, raise it all down, and rebuild it. But
Hmm.
they were there first and had the better, higher landed properties that were less affected. And now and generationally, they're now being pushed out.
Hmm.
Uh, and that wouldn't happen if it were really a true, serious democracy
Right.
where they had the same voice as the people with the money.
Right. Yep. And the Greenlanders.
Yes.
So it's all just variations on the same theme.
Well,
Yeah,
or the Canadians, because that's going to be the 52nd state, right?
51st, 52nd, 53rd, maybe each province gets to be a state.
Well,
Um,
I so totally now want to go back to
Woodard.
uh not Woodard, but no, there's a guy, Daniel Immerwahr, who's
Oh
got
yeah, yeah.
the
Yep.
how to hide an empire.
Yeah.
We won't give statehood to Guam or Puerto Rico because it gives too many votes for, brown people.
Right. Well, and that's the weird thing is this whole question of U.S. colonialism, um, versus the Chinese Belt and Road, um, which is not apparently it's apparently seeking, I mean, it seems to me to be seeking the same ultimate endpoint, but with different, with a kind of a different set of language around it, which reminds me of this section at the beginning of section D here, recuperation, right, where he starts talking about capitalism and sort of rethinking capitalism as something that, well, when and how and what is it and when did it begin? And we can't really say that that it is, democracy and capitalism are, sort of coterminous and the same thing and arose from the same seeds because we already had capitalism before we had any of this other stuff. And I mean, and it reminds me a lot of kind of Adam Smith, right? And the way that we misunderstand Adam Smith and what he was talking about when he was talking about, free markets and mercantilism and the invisible hand and all that.
Well, and some of our reading before we've come across that. How do you even misread John Kenneth Galbraith or some of the other modern economic thinkers that underpin the Republican Party platform.
Mhm.
And, they pick and chose amongst the best, things that supported their cause rather than the broader philosophical underpinnings of what was really being said. But that's, again, it goes back to we're not well educated enough to be
Mhm.
able to tear those things apart and do the thinking and work. And I think what even gets us more is life moves so much faster now and there's so much more information. You can't consume it all.
Yeah.
You can't know it all.
Yeah.
And as a result, you have to then put your trust in someone else who's an expert in that area to get, you don't know how to fix your own car, so you take it to a mechanic because you feel like you can trust them to fix the thing and maybe do it for a fair price.
Mhm.
But that doesn't happen in politics. You can't always trust that the person you've elected is really going to have the majority's interests at heart. And
Mhm.
then once they're there, they're spending all their time fundraising to stay in the spot, and all the legislation then goes to the people pushing money to keep them in positions of power.
Yeah. Yeah. I also like the kind of, I mean, and again, it's probably sort of conspiracy theory adjacent. Though the thing that he does in that very next paragraph in section D, where he starts talking about European powers thinking of themselves as being democratic, but at the same time, he says pursuing an intentional policy of supporting reactionary elites um, outside of their country against those pushing for anything remotely resembling democratic reforms overseas, right? And so he talks about, Great Britain and the Ottoman Empire and Muhammad Ali in Egypt, and um, and then and then of course the Opium Wars and coming down on the Qing and then supporting them in the Taiping Rebellion, right? This idea that we will basically take over these polities of other, non-democratic polities, but then we will support them against something that comes along that is much more sort of like what we said we wanted, right? So I mean, and I don't know that it's really entirely accurate to characterize the Taiping Rebellion as something that would have led to democracy or anything like that, right? It was a bit crazy, but the idea that we had just crushed the Qing and then we supported it against them, or they had just crushed Muhammad Ali and then and then that strikes me as kind of an interesting an interesting instance of that kind of deliberate mismatch between rhetoric and action that is this I think is probably a bigger part of the story of democracy. A face in the crowd, yeah. Yes, that would probably be something that would a face in actually, you know what? Maybe I should put that on my calendar for next weekend's movie. Should be a
I
face
think
in
it's on the Criterion channel right now.
Hmm.
If
Yeah, I
you
think
have
it somewhere in the summer it popped up on one or more of the streaming services that
Yeah.
came back for free at least.
Yeah,
Uh,
I mean, it got on my list, I think, because Chris, you had mentioned it, and then it fell off my list because time. But
Right. Right. It did mine too. And I think it makes sense to probably make an effort.
and what kills me is it's a hot mic moment that gets him in the end. Spoiler alert, sorry.
Mhm.
Although it's even with the spoiler alert, but the problem is we've gotten to a point where, you know,
what is a hot mic anymore?
yeah, there is no such thing, or at least for some politicians,
Right.
if you're a Republican, there's no such thing as a hot mic moment. It's just like you can now say the things you couldn't say 10 years ago, which is what the whole backlash against, political correctness was about.
It really does seem
So-
like all of the hot mics that have happened recently have been time machine hot mics, where you go back 10 or 15 or 20 years.
Yeah.
So
And we don't call it political correctness anymore. We call it being woke.
I'm pretty sure my first hot mic moment was a 22 caliber mine in a 365 Magnum World. To which CJ says to Bartlett, "That's unusually a gun metaphor for you. Did you not see that the mic was still on?"
We've
So that makes it an anti-hot mic moment because he did it on purpose.
Well, there's the assumption the way it was shot shows he does it on purpose. So, but the other thing that's coming, even I'm going to bring Rory back again. Of course, what's happened since the West Wing is, of course, we've had Obama, and Obama, rather like Kennedy versus Nixon, Kennedy was the first big TV success and clearly walked all over Nixon in many respects. Obama obviously did something that managed to get him 2 terms, right? And much of that was social media, TikTok and Twitter and so forth. The person who did that for Obama was brought over to the UK by, I forgot what his name is now. The guy that did the Brexit, Cameron, brought over by Cameron, and was introduced to particularly all of the new MPs for Cameron's second term, which included Rory. And subsequent to that, when he was Prisons Minister or Theresa May, his immediate lineup, as the senior minister, was Liz Truss as Home Minister. Liz Truss apparently is well known for being Miss Instagram. Everything she sees written down has to come over in Instagrammable chunks. So you present her with a 25-page report, she'll look at the executive summary, and if it can't go on Instagram, it gets tossed. So there's all of those. We talked about, Chris already mentioned, and you already mentioned, the interpersonal skills amongst politicians that are maybe in the same administration, but maybe not, maybe in opposition here. But you get on to get the stuff done because that's what your backers want, so that you can have enough money to run next time. And we haven't quite got that bad in money terms, but we're not far off. But because we still have a general post office, all candidates get given a certain amount of postage, depending on how many people there are in the constituency. You don't get that same postage for leadership ones. But Rory's campaign for leader against, amongst others, Boris Johnson, was all driven off of Twitter. He'd get a push past by the press, so he'd take exactly the same question onto Twitter, and he'd get 250,000, 500,000, or 3 million even. So it's his responses. And yet the person who pushed him away has got an official circulation of 250,000. You know, so he very quickly realized that he doesn't need the press need him.
Mhm.
So he eventually literally just tweeted, I'm going to XYZ coffee shop in Barking. Anybody wants to come by? I'll be there all day. And so off he goes. And he was getting huge amounts. And in the end, that's what got reported, was that he was dragging the people in and was talking sense, in spite of the fact they all said he was talking junk originally. It's quite, and I missed it because I was here. I didn't see that level of day to day, hour by hour stuff, and I'm not on Twitter anyway. So,
Mhm.
uh, so it's quite a good read going back.
Mhm.
And it's how do you drive? How do you drive your message in the current thing, particularly when you've got political cartoonists putting uh, Bezos kneeling down in front of Trump, and the
Yeah.
cartoon stopped, and now it's got to be the most famous cartoon of the week,
Oh.
and maybe even the year. You never
Well,
know.
It's the
Remi-
year is young.
It reminds me of the Emerson quote, though. A system grinder hates the truth. So it's not even do you make sense, but because everyone's already so inundated with even things that could be true, you now throw in a ton of crap on
Mhm.
top of it, which makes it even harder to delve in, and everybody throws their arms up and gives up.
Mhm.
Um,
Well, there's that uh, Tommy Lee Jones film where he's the funeral director for about 10 funeral homes in southern Missouri or southern Mississippi. And it turns out there's a Canadian firm, amongst other things, trying to roll up all the businesses because they've worked out that obviously all the baby boomers are going to die soon. And it's a contract law, John Grisham type story, but it's not a John Grisham.
Interesting.
And
Kind of
um,
under too.
it's a how does business think and
Yeah.
make money from what might be a disaster, or at least make money from a downside. And as you were saying about all the burnouts, because of the way the insurance works, or the insurance doesn't work, it's going to be who's got the money to redevelop. The price obviously just went up anyway, because now there's too much work.
Mhm.
So there's the real market force of that. And then it's like, okay, how can I abuse that rise in price to raise the price more so? Like with all your just pre-election stuff is as the biggest problem is the price of eggs. You're in the middle of an avian pandemic, you're killing flocks. Why would you expect the price not to go up? Right?
We don't
So-
talk about the avian flu. It's nothing to worry about. Just because it's happened the last 2 years in a row.
And there are a lot of conspiracies about the avian flu.
So what's the price of eggs?
A lot of theories. They're high.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But oddly enough, because there's been a shift in the price of eggs, therefore the worldwide market even, here is now also getting Turkish eggs
Oh.
because we can't get American eggs anymore, which is driving some of the white population here nuts because they like the American eggs. And
Weird.
it's like it's eggs and eggs and eggs.
Yeah, is there a distinction between eggs raised in by Turkish hens, laid by Turkish hens?
Well,
Is it the
you've-
food that they eat?
we can still go. I can go on my shelf and get a tray of eggs for 20 dirhams. 20 dirhams is like $7.
Well,
But they'll be grain fed in housing and local.
Yeah.
But I could also go and get free range eggs that are local. And those probably half as much again. But I can get imported free range eggs that are organic as well, supposedly.
claim to be.
And they're like 40 a dozen versus 20 for a tray of 30.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
there's a spread.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
There's a
and
spread.
I'm always suspicious of the claims. Maybe it's just my own paranoia.
Yeah.
Of the organic.
How
versus
much- how
What
much
does
of
free
the
range
price?
really mean? What does
Yeah,
organic really mean?
I mean, there are
I
defined
mean-
terms, but
Cage
what's
free.
what's
Yeah,
what's
but-
the enforced
But
speed rate?
in free range, we all know what we think it means.
Right.
Yeah.
As in our dream think it means. It means what Richard Perkins does. So he's basically feeding his chickens primarily on the bugs in the cow shit that is in
Yeah.
the field.
Yeah.
The chicken follows the cows by about 5 days.
Right, or table scraps or chickens. Yeah, chickens are omnivores. But
And Chris, why would they?
yeah.
But versus it means free range means I've got twice the foot area in housing.
Right. We're
I
not
have
11.
to
We're
have.
not 11 to a 1.1 square foot cage anymore. We're, we have one. We have
Running round
we have
free.
1 square foot each in a warehouse. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's But to go back to because we're about out of time. To go back to the politics that we were talking about, I think what sums it up for me, and we didn't really make it through this chapter, so maybe we should do the rest of the chapter later. But where I'm up to is in my Kindle about page 49, and he says in the Muslim trading acumen of the Indian Ocean, some of Huntington's values, a certain notion of liberty, a certain notion of equality, and some very explicit ideas about freedom of trade and the rule of law have long been considered important. Others, such as religious tolerance, might well have become values as a result of Europeans coming onto the scene, if only by point of contrast, which is a little bit of irony that I thought was kind of fun that he inserted it. So they got ideas about the rule of law and freedom of trade by looking at the breaches in European actions versus their rhetoric. But then he goes on to say, my real point is that one simply cannot lay any of these values down to one particular moral, intellectual, or cultural tradition. They arise, for better or worse, from exactly this sort of interaction. So,
Huntington is one of the types on the Wikipedia article. I've not heard of it before.
yeah. So I mean, it seems to me that is, I mean, that doesn't leave us with a conclusion. So that's unsatisfying in terms of deciding what we think about this. But if what we end up thinking about this is, it's complicated and it grew out of this dialogue or this dialectic or this interaction, then yeah, I don't know. Maybe that's a place to end for today. So we were gonna cover a lot. I mean, we talked about in the section, it wasn't in the community forum. I think it was in the schedule in folder 24 there. Should we just kind of try to continue with parts 1 and 2, which we said we were going to do today, next time we meet on the 18th, and then plan from there after we see how far, see whether we make it.
On the 18th, Dan, or on the 25th?
The 18th.
Bi-weekly or no?
Let me double check. We did talk about going bi-weekly. We could do, I think, let me double check and see if I could do the 25th. I've got actually I can't really do the 25th because I'm going up north to see my kids. So could we do it on the 18th and then resume again on the 1st of February?
Yeah, that'll work.
Okay.
Yeah. I think so.
Cool. Then we'll finish this chapter and the shorter essays in the next part, which is the against economics part. All right. Thanks.
It's good to see
Thanks.
everybody.
And Chris,
Thanks, everyone.
we'll be thinking about you. Good luck.
Best wishes.
Fingers
Yeah.
crossed.
Yep, absolutely. Take care.